Close your eyes for a second. Now imagine this. You're standing in a forest, but it's not like any forest you've ever seen. The air is so thick with oxygen that every breath makes your head spin. Your heart's racing, not from fear, not yet, but from the sheer chemical intensity of the atmosphere around you. One sparked, one lightning strike, and even the soaking wet trees around you would explode into flames that nothing could stop. You look up, something passes overhead. For a split second, your brain tries to make sense of it. A bird. No, birds don't exist yet. This thing has four wings veined like stained glass, beating independently. And it's huge, wingspan wider than your arms stretched out, eyes the size of golf balls, watching everything, seeing in slow motion while you move in real time. It's hunting, and you just became visible. And that's a dragonfly, except it's not. It's Meganeura, and 300 million years ago, it owned the skies. You hear something behind you? A rustling, steady, methodical. You turn around slowly, and that's when you see it crawling through the ferns. At first, you think it's a fallen log. Dark, segmented, maybe 8 feet long. But then it bends. It moves. Dozens of legs ripple in perfect coordination, pushing this armored nightmare forward through the undergrowth. It's not a log. It's not a snake. It's Arthropleura, the largest land invertebrate that has ever existed. And it's heading right toward you. Your instinct is to run. But where? Because crouched in the shadows, nearly invisible against the decaying plant matter, is something else. Something with too many legs and an arched tail that curves over its body like a question mark with a very sharp answer. A scorpion, the size of a house cat, with pincers that could crush bone and a stinger loaded with enough venom to drop you in seconds. This is Earth. Your Earth. It's not the version you know. Welcome to the Carboniferous Period. A time when our planet's atmosphere contained 35% oxygen, almost double what we breathe today. And that one difference, that extra oxygen in the air, changed everything. Insects didn't just survive here. They became giants, monsters, apex predators. This was their world, and for 60 million years, they ruled it absolutely. But here's the thing. This world, it can never exist again. The conditions that created it were a one-time event, a biological accident that evolution eventually corrected. And when it did, the giants fell. Every single one of them. So if you're here to learn something wild, to see a side of Earth that feels like pure science fiction, but was 100% real, then you're in the right place. Drop a like if this already sounds insane. Comment your city and time zone. I want to know where everyone's watching from. Last video had people from Tokyo, Berlin, and Sao Paulo all tuning in. The internet's weird like that, right? Alright, let's step back in time. To a world of fire, oxygen, and giants that will haunt your dreams. Let's go. Alright, let's rewind the clock. Way back, we're talking 300 million years ago, give or take a few million. Earth doesn't look anything like the place, you know. If you pulled up Google Maps back then, you'd be seriously confused. There's no North America, no Africa, no Europa, at least not in the way we recognize them today. Instead, the continents are slowly smashing together like pieces of a planetary jigsaw puzzle, forming one massive supercontinent called Pangaea. Imagine all the land on Earth crammed into one giant landmass, stretching from the North Pole all the way down to the South Pole, surrounded by one enormous ocean. No Atlantic, no Pacific, just Pangaea and the sea. And this wasn't some barren wasteland. This was a world in the middle of a biological revolution. The land was raw, newly conquered, and it was humid like, step out, side and instantly sweat kind of humid. The air was thick, heavy, and it wasn't just the moisture you'd feel. There was something else in the atmosphere, something that would change everything. But before we get to that, let's talk about what you'd actually see if you could stand in the middle of a carboniferous landscape. The first thing that would hit you, the forests. Except these weren't forests like the ones we have today. No oak trees, no penis, no flowers, no fruits, no grass. In fact, the world was still hundreds of millions of years away from seeing its first daisy or hearing the buzz of a bee. What you'd see instead were towering lycopods, ancient club mosses that grew up to 100 feet tall. That's a 10-story building. And here's the kicker. They weren't even real trees. Not in the way we think of trees anyway. These plants had hollow, water-filled stems. They didn't have wood inside them like modern trees do. They were more like gigantic spore-producing stalks held up by internal water pressure. If you cut one down, it'd be more like slicing open a thick, fibrous water balloon than chopping through solid wood. Next to them stood seed ferns, plants that looked like ferns, but reproduced with seeds and giant horsetails, relatives of the tiny horsetails you might see near a pond today, except these were the size of telephone poles. And then there were the fungi, not the little mushrooms you toss in a salad. We're talking tree-sized fungi, some reaching nearly 25 feet high, standing like alien towers in the dim, damp undergrowth. This was a world so old that even plants were still figuring things out. Evolution was experimenting. Some of these species would survive and evolve. Others would vanish entirely, leaving only fossils behind as proof they ever existed. Now, picture yourself walking through one of these forests. Your boots sink into the ground with every step. The soil isn't really soil, it's more like a spongy, waterlogged mat of decaying plant matter. Peat, thick, dark, and saturated. Beneath your feet, millions of years of dead plants are piling up, layer upon layer, slowly compressing under the weight of time. And this is important because all that dead plant material, it wasn't rotting away like it does today. There was nothing around that could break it down efficiently. No advanced fungi, no termites, no bacteria specialized in decomposing tough plant fibers. So instead of decaying, the plants just kept piling up, getting buried under swamp water and mud, locked away from the air. Over millions of years, that carboniferous plant matter would compress and transform into coal, the very coal we dig up and burn today to power our cities. That's why this period is called the Carboniferous. In the first place, it literally means every time you see a coal power plant or a chunk of charcoal, you're looking at the compressed remains of these ancient alien forests. But here's the thing. This wasn't just some quirky feature of prehistoric plant life. This growing, dying, and getting buried without decomposing had a massive side effect. A side effect that would completely reshape life on Earth. Because every time a plant photosynthesizes, it takes in carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. That's basic biology, right? But in the Carboniferous, something unusual was happening. The plants were producing oxygen at an absolutely massive scale. And because all that dead plant matter was getting buried instead of rotting, the carbon wasn't being released back into the atmosphere. It was being locked away underground, which meant the oxygen just kept building up and up and up. Scientists estimate that by the late Carboniferous period, atmospheric oxygen levels reached around 35%. Today, we breathe air that's about 21% oxygen, so we're talking almost double. And that difference, that extra oxygen in the air, it changed everything. If you were somehow transported back to the Carboniferous, the first thing you'd notice is that the air feels different, thicker, richer. Every breath you take would flood your lungs with more oxygen than your body is used to. At first, you might feel a bit lightheaded, maybe even euphoric. Your heart would start racing, trying to adjust to the sudden surplus of oxygen in your bloodstream. But here's the scary part. That much oxygen in the air makes everything incredibly flammable. You know how a candle burns brighter and faster if you give it more oxygen? Same principle. In the Carboniferous, even damp wood could catch fire. A single lightning strike could ignite a forest fire that would rage out of control, consuming everything in its path, wet or dry. It didn't matter. Spontaneous combustion wasn't just possible, it was a regular occurrence. Fossil records show thick layers of charcoal from this period, evidence of massive, repeated wildfires. The world was literally on fire, over and over again. And yet, the forests kept growing back, fueled by that oxygen-rich atmosphere and the endless humidity of the swampy lowlands. But the fires weren't the only consequence of all that oxygen. Because while humans would struggle in this world, there was one group of animals that absolutely thrived. One group that took full advantage of the extra oxygen and grew. Two sizes we can barely imagine today. Arthropods. Insects. Spiders, millipedes, scorpions. These creatures didn't just survive in the Carboniferous. They became giants, apex predators, monsters. And to understand why, we need to talk about how they breathe, because that's the key to everything. Let's talk about breathing for a second. Something we take for granted, right? You breathe in, your lungs expand, oxygen gets absorbed into your blood, and your heart pumps it throughout your body. Simple, efficient, elegant. But insects, they do it completely differently. And that difference is exactly why the Carboniferous was their golden age. Insects don't have lungs, no diaphragm, no air sacs, no deep, satisfying breaths. Instead, their entire respiratory system is built around a network of tiny tubes called trachea. These tubes branch throughout their bodies like a subway system, delivering oxygen directly to their cells through a process called passive diffusion. Think of it like this. Imagine millions of microscopic snorkels running through an insect's body. Oxygen enters through small openings in their exoskeleton, called spiracles, and then it just drifts inward. No pumping required. The oxygen moves from areas of high concentration outside the body to areas of low concentration inside the cells, naturally, passively. For small insects, this system works beautifully. It's simple, lightweight, and energy efficient. A fruit fly, no problem. A mosquito, easy. But here's the catch. Passive diffusion doesn't scale well. The bigger you get, the longer those tracheotubes have to be. And the longer the tubes, the harder it is for oxygen to reach the center of your body. It's like trying to breathe through a straw. A short straw, fine, but a straw that's 3 feet long. You're going to struggle in today's atmosphere. With 21% oxygen, this creates a hot limit on how big insects can grow. The largest insects alive today, like the giant waiter from New Zealand, are about the size of your palm. These chunky, cricket-like creatures can weigh up to 70 grams, which is impressive for an insect. But that's about as big as they can get, before their respiratory system just can't keep up. But in the Carboniferous, with 35% oxygen in the air, that limit disappeared suddenly. Even large-bodied insects could get enough oxygen through passive diffusion. The higher concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere meant it could travel farther into their bodies, reaching cells that would normally be starved of oxygen in today's air. It was like evolution handed insects a performance-enhancing drug, and the insects took full advantage. This isn't just speculation, by the way. Scientists have actually tested this. In 2007, researchers at Arizona State University ran an experiment where they raised modern insects in controlled environments with different oxygen concentrations. They wanted to see if higher oxygen levels would actually make insects grow larger. The results were striking. When raised in hyperoxic conditions, air with more oxygen than normal, some species of dragonflies and beetles grew significantly larger than their regular counterparts. The genetic potential for gigantism was still there, locked away in their DNA. They just needed the right atmospheric conditions to express it, which tells us something incredible. The same principles that allowed insects to grow enormous 300 million years ago are still lurking inside their genomes today. They haven't lost the ability to grow large. They're just limited by the amount of oxygen in the air. But oxygen wasn't the only factor. There's another piece to this puzzle that's equally important, and it has to do with atmospheric density. C. The Carboniferous atmosphere wasn't just richer in oxygen, it was also denser overall. Computer models suggest that the combination of higher oxygen levels and different concentrations of carbon dioxide created an atmosphere that was roughly 20 to 25% denser than what we breathe today. And for flying insects, that made all the difference. Denser air provides more lift. It's easier to stay airborne. Think about it like swimming versus walking. Water is denser than air, which is why you can float in a pool, but not in your living room. In the Carboniferous, the air was thick enough that flying was less energetically expensive. Wings could generate more lift with each beat. Gliding was easier. Hovering required less effort. For a massive insect like Meganeura, which we'll meet properly in the next chapter, this was crucial. With a wingspan of nearly 2.5 feet, there's no way it could fly efficiently in today's atmosphere. The air just isn't dense enough. But in the Carboniferous, it would have been like gliding through a thick, supportive medium, almost effortless compared to the struggle it would face today. And it wasn't just insects that benefited. Early tetrapods, the amphibian-like creatures that were just beginning to explore life on land, would have found the dense oxygen-rich air much easier to breathe. Their lungs were primitive, not nearly as efficient as ours, but with so much oxygen available, they didn't need to be efficient. They could afford to be clumsy breathers. This might have been a crucial factor that allowed vertebrates to make the leap from water to land in the first place. The Carboniferous atmosphere was like a biological safety net, making it easier for early land animals to survive, while their bodies were still figuring out how to function outside the water. But let's get back to the insects. Because while the oxygen and atmospheric density explain how they could grow so large, there's another question worth asking. Why did they grow so large? In biology, size usually comes with advantages. Bigger animals are harder to kill. They can overpower smaller predators. They can access food sources that smaller creatures can't reach. They can regulate their body temperature more effectively. And in the world of insects, where so much of survival depends on not getting eaten, being big was a serious advantage. But there's also a cost. Larger bodies require more energy to maintain. They're slower to develop. They're easier for predators to spot. And if the environment changes, say, if oxygen levels drop, large-bodied insects are the first to suffer, which is exactly what happened. But we'll get to that later. For now, just imagine what the Carboniferous world must have looked like. Endless swampy forests, towering plants that weren't quite trees, a thick, humid atmosphere, supercharged with oxygen, and crawling, flying, and hunting through it all were creatures unlike anything alive today. This wasn't just a weird chapter in Earth's history. It was a full-blown biological experiment, a test case for what life could become under radically different atmospheric conditions. And for 60 million years, it worked. Let's zoom in on the insects themselves. Because understanding how they were built, how their bodies were engineered, helps us understand just how alien the Carboniferous really was. We've already talked about their respiratory system, those branching tracheal tubes that delivered oxygen through passive diffusion. But there's more to the story. Because even with abundant oxygen, there are physical limits to how large an insect can grow, and those limits have everything to do with their exoskeletons. Unlike us, insects don't have internal skeletons. They don't have bones. Instead, their bodies are supported by a hard external shell made of chitin, a tough, flexible material that's also found in the shells of crabs and lobsters. This exoskeleton serves multiple purposes. It protects them from predators, prevents water loss, and provides anchor points for their muscles. But here's the problem. As an insect grows, its exoskeleton has to grow too. And unlike our bones, which grow continuously throughout childhood, an exoskeleton can't grow gradually. It has to be shed and replaced in a process called molting. During molting, an insect literally crawls out of its old exoskeleton, leaving behind a perfect, hollow replica of itself. For a few hours, this new exoskeleton is soft and vulnerable. The insect has to hide, staying as still as possible while the new shell hardens. And the bigger the insect, the more dangerous this process becomes. A giant insect molting is basically helpless. It can't run. It can't fight. It's a sitting target. And in a world full of predators, that's a serious risk. But the Carboniferous giants managed. Somehow, they navigated this vulnerability and survived long enough to reach their massive adult sizes. And once they did, they were nearly unstoppable. Take their strength. For example, when insects are, pound for pound, some of the strongest animals on Earth, a dung beetle can pull over 1,100 times its own body weight. If a human could do that, we'd be pulling 6 full-size buses at the same time. Rhinoceros beetles can lift 850 times their weight. Leafcutter ants can carry 50 times their weight. Even tiny trapjaw ants have a bite force 50 times their body weight. Why are insects so strong? It comes down to how their muscles attach to their exoskeletons. Because the skeleton is on the outside, muscles can attach at angles that give them incredible mechanical advantage. It's like having a built-in lever system throughout your entire body. Now scale that up. Imagine an insect the size of a dog with that same mechanical advantage. The strength would be phenomenal. A scorpion the size of a house cat, with pincers strong enough to crush bone. A millipede as long as your couch, with enough force in its legs to plow through thick underbrush without slowing down. These weren't fragile creatures. They were armored, powerful, and built to dominate their environment. But strength alone doesn't make you a successful predator. You also need to be able to sense your surroundings, track, prey, and react quickly. And the Carboniferous giants had that covered too. Many arthropods have compound eye size, made up of hundreds or even thousands of individual lenses. Each lens captures a small piece of the visual field, and the brain stitches them all together into one continuous image. It's not as sharp as our vision, but it's incredibly good at detecting movement. Dragonflies, both ancient and modern, have some of the most advanced compound eyes in the insect world. They can see nearly 360 degrees around them. They can track multiple moving objects at once, and they can react in a fraction of a second, adjusting their flight path mid-air to intercept prey. For a predator like Meganeura, this visual system would have been devastating. Nothing could sneak up on it. Nothing could escape once it locked on. It was like having a built-in targeting computer. Scorpions, on the other hand, relied more on tactile and vibrational senses. They had sensory hairs all over their bodies that could detect the slightest movement in the air or ground. They could feel a small animal approaching from several feet away, even in complete darkness. And then there were their pedipalps, those large, claw-like appendages at the front of their bodies. These weren't just for show. They were precision instruments, capable of detecting vibrations, testing surfaces, and grasping prey with crushing force. Put it all together, and you have an apex predator. Not because its fast scorpions aren't particularly quick, but because it doesn't need to be. It's patient, it waits, it senses. And when the moment is right, it strikes. The genius of arthropod body plans is their modularity. Insects and their relatives are built from repeating segments, each with its own set of legs, sensory organs, or specialized appendages. It's like a biological Lego system. Need more legs? Add more segments? Need better sensors? Modify a segment. Need a weapon? Turn a leg into a claw? This modularity gave arthropods incredible evolutionary flexibility. They could adapt to almost any ecological niche. And in the Carboniferous, with so much oxygen available and so few competitors, they exploded into a dizzying array of forms. Some became herbivores, munching on the primitive plants that covered the forest floor. Others became filter feeders, sifting through the muck of swampy ponds. And still others became predators, hunting everything from smaller insects to the first clumsy amphibians trying to make a life on land. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these creatures is that they weren't evolutionary dead ends. They were pioneers. They were testing new strategies, new body plans, new ways of living that would echo through the rest of Earth's history. When insects evolved flight in the Carboniferous, they opened up an entirely new dimension of life on Earth. For the first time, animals could travel through the air, escaping ground-based predators and accessing new food sources. It was a revolution as significant as the first animals crawling onto land. And the descendants of these Carboniferous pioneers, they're still here. Every dragonfly you see darting over a pond is using the same basic flight system that evolved 300 million years ago. Every beetle, every ant, every butterfly carries genetic echoes of that ancient world. They're smaller now. They've adapted to lower oxygen levels, to new predators, to a world that's changed beyond recognition. But they survived, and that's something worth appreciating. Because the giants didn't last forever. The world that made them possible was already beginning to change. And in the next chapter, we're going to meet them face to face, the monsters of the Carboniferous before they vanish into history. Let's meet the apex predator of the Carboniferous skies, the creature that ruled the air for millions of years, long before birds, before bats, before anything with feathers or fur ever thought about taking flight. Its name is Meganeura, and if you saw one today, you'd probably freeze in place, unsure whether to run or just accept your fate. Meganeura looked like a dragonfly, but calling it a dragonfly is like calling a great white shark a fish. Technically accurate, but it doesn't capture the scale or the terror. This thing had a wingspan of up to 28 inches. That's over 2 feet from wingtip to wingtip. Its body stretched about 13 inches long. If it landed on your chest, its wings would hang over both your shoulders. And it wasn't some clumsy glider. Meganeura was built for precision hunting, an aerial assassin with 4 independently moving wings, enormous compound eyes, and a pre-capture success rate that modern dragonflies still match today, over 90%. That's better than lions, better than sharks, better than almost any predator alive. Let's break down what made this creature so terrifyingly effective. First, the wings, 4 of them, arranged in 2 pairs. Unlike most flying insects today, Meganeura could control each wing independently. This gave it maneuverability that would make a modern helicopter pilot jealous. It could hover in place, scanning the forest floor. It could accelerate forward in a burst of speed. It could bank hard left or right, adjusting its flight path and it could fly backwards, something most insects still can't do. The wings themselves were engineering marvels. Fossilized remains show an intricate network of veins running through them, creating a grid-like structure that was both lightweight and incredibly strong. These veins weren't just for support, they also helped stiffen the wing during flight, allowing it to generate more lift and thrust with each beat in the dense Carboniferous atmosphere. With 35% oxygen and higher air density, those wings would have made Meganeura almost supernaturally agile. It could dart between the towering lycopod trees, weave through hanging vines, and chase down prey through cluttered, three-dimensional space without ever losing speed. Now let's talk about the eyes. Massive compound eyes that took up most of its head, giving a nearly 360-degree vision. Each eye was made up of thousands of individual lenses, each one capturing a slightly different angle of the world. The insect's brain would stitch all these images together into one continuous, panoramic view. But here's what makes dragonfly vision truly special. They can see fast, much faster than we can. While humans processed visual information at about 60 frames per second, dragonflies process it at over 200 frames per second. To a dragonfly, the world moves in slow motion. Mat mosquito zipping past at full speed. To Meganeura, it might as well be hovering. This meant that once Meganeura locked onto a target, escape was nearly impossible. It could track multiple moving objects at once, predict their trajectory, and intercept them with surgical precision. And when it caught something, that's when things got really brutal. Meganeura's legs were covered in sharp barb-like spines. When it grabbed prey mid-flight, those legs would fold together, forming a spiny basket that trapped the victim against its body. There was no escape. The more the prey struggled, the deeper the barbs dug in. And Meganeura didn't bother landing to eat. It would consume its prey on the wing, tearing off pieces with powerful mandibles while still flying. Efficient, ruthless, perfect. So what did it hunt? Fossil evidence and biomechanical modeling suggest it fed on other insects, smaller flying species, crawling arthropods, maybe even juvenile amphibians, if they were small and slow enough. Anything soft-bodied and unlucky enough to cross its path was fair game. But here's something we often forget. Meganeura didn't start its life as an aerial predator. Like modern dragonflies, it almost certainly began life underwater. Dragonfly nymphs today are aquatic predators, living in ponds and streams for months or even years before they emerge as adults. They're ambush hunters, lurking in the muck, waiting for prey to swim by. When something gets close, tadpoles, small fish, other insects, they strike with lightning speed, grabbing their victim with an extendable lower jaw called a labium. It's like having a built-in harpoon gun under your chin. Meganeura's nymphs were probably similar, only much larger. Imagine a juvenile Meganeura, perhaps a foot long, hiding among the roots and vegetation of a carboniferous swamp. It's waiting, watching. A small amphibian swims past, and snap it's caught, pulled under, and devoured. After months or years of hunting underwater, the nymph would finally crawl out onto a rock or plant stem. His exoskeleton would split open, and the adult would emerge, unfurling its massive wings for the first time. It would sit there for hours, vulnerable and exposed, while its wings hardened and its body adjusted to breathing air instead of extracting oxygen from water. And then it would take off, and for the rest of its life, maybe a few months, maybe a year, it would own the skies. But Meganeura wasn't alone up there. The Carboniferous skies were crowded with other flying arthropods, many of them just as strange and oversized. There was Paleodictyoptera, for instance. These creatures had wingspans ranging from 15 to 22 inches, making them some of the largest flying insects of their time. But unlike Meganeura, they weren't predators. They were gentle herbivores, feeding on plant sap and soft vegetation. Paleodictyoptera had something unusual: 6 wing-like structures, 4 actual wings that they used for powered flight, and 2 smaller winglets near the front of their thorax. Scientists aren't entirely sure what these extra winglets were for. Maybe they helped with stability. Maybe they were evolutionary leftovers from an earlier stage of insect development. Either way, they made these insects look even more alien. Their mouths were equipped with a primitive, proboscis needle-like projection they used to pierce plant tissues and suck out fluids. They were among the first insects to evolve specialized feeding strategies beyond just chewing. In a way, they were the ancestors of modern butterflies, moths, and mosquitoes, all of which use modified mouthparts to feed on liquids. Fossilized Paleodictyoptera wings show intricate patterns, almost like stained glass. We can't know for sure what colors they had. Fossils preserve structure, not pigment, but it's tempting to imagine them as vibrant, patterned creatures, drifting through the Carboniferous canopy like living kites. But here's the really profound thing about these insects. They were the very first animals to fly. For billions of years, life on Earth was confined to the ground and the water. You could crawl, you could swim, but you couldn't fly. The air was off limits, an entire dimension of the planet that remained unexplored. And then, sometime in the Carboniferous, insects figured it out. Exactly how a still debated dead wings evolved from gills, from flaps used for gliding, from extensions of the exoskeleton. But however it happened, it changed everything. Suddenly, animals could escape predators by launching into the air. They could travel vast distances without touching the ground. They could access food sources, high leaves, tree sap, other flying insects that were completely unreachable before. Flight was a revolution, and the arthropods got there first. Millions of years before vertebrates would even attempt it. The Carboniferous skies were a proving ground, a place where evolution experimented with different wing designs, different flight styles, different hunting strategies. Some insects became fast, agile predators like Meganeura. Others became slow, graceful gliders like Paleodictyoptera, and still other species we may never find fossils of. Probably tried approaches that didn't work and went extinct without leaving a trace. But the ones that survived passed their innovations down through the generations, and those innovations are still with us. Every time you see a butterfly fluttering past, or a dragonfly hovering over a stream, or a beetle buzzing clumsily toward a porch light, you're seeing the legacy of the Carboniferous aerial pioneers. They weren't just big bugs. They were evolutionary trailblazers, the first creatures to truly master three-dimensional movement through Earth's atmosphere. And for tens of millions of years, they owned the skies, completely. No birds to compete with, no bats, no pterosaurs, just insects, ruling an aerial kingdom that had never existed before. But as dominant as Meganeura was in the air, the forest floor had its own horrors. Creatures that didn't need wings to be terrifying. Creatures that hunted with patience, precision, and crushing force. And we're about to meet them. While Meganeura ruled the skies, down on the forest floor, something else was waiting. Something that moved slowly, deliberately, with too many legs and an armored body that seemed almost indestructible. You're walking through a swamp forest. Your boots sink into the wet peat with every step. Ferns brush against your legs. The air is thick, heavy, hard to breathe. And then you hear it, a rustling in the undergrowth. Not fast, not panicked, just steady, methodical U-turn. And that's when you see it. A scorpion. But not like any scorpion you've ever seen. This one is nearly 2.5 feet long, about the size of a house cat. Its body is covered in thick, dark armor, segmented like overlapping plates of obsidian. Its tail arches high above its back, ending in a curved stinger that gleams in the dim forest light. And its pincers, those massive, crushing pedipalps, held out in front, serrated on the inside, perfect for gripping struggling prey. This is Pulmonoscorpius, the largest scorpion to have ever walked the earth, and for millions of years, it was the apex predator of the Carboniferous forest floor. Let's talk about how this thing hunted. Pulmonoscorpius wasn't built for speed. It didn't need to be. This was an ambush predator, a creature that relied on stealth, patience, and overwhelming force. It would hide in the shadows under fallen logs, beneath thick layers of fern litter, in the dark spaces between club moss roots, and wait. And he could wait for a long time. Modern scorpions can survive for months without food, slowing their metabolism to a crawl. Pulmonoscorpius probably had the same ability. He could afford to be patient because, when the right prey came along, it had all the tools it needed to make the kill. First, the sensory equipment. Pulmonoscorpius had multiple types of eyes, 2 large central eyes that likely provided depth perception, and several smaller lateral eyes spread across its carapace for detecting motion and changes in light. But vision wasn't its primary sense. Like modern scorpions, Pulmonoscorpius almost certainly had sensory hairs, called trichobothria, covering its legs and pedipalps. These hairs are incredibly sensitive to air currents and vibrations. A small animal walking nearby, a scorpion would feel it. a juvenile amphibian hopping through the underbrush. The vibrations from each landing would telegraph its position. Pulmonoscorpius, it didn't need to see you to know you were there. It could feel you coming from several feet away, could sense the direction and speed of your approach, and could calculate the perfect moment to strike. And when it struck, it was fast. Scorpions may be slow walkers, but their pedipalps move with explosive speed. One moment the prey is walking past, oblivious. The next moment, those massive pincers snap shut, crushing the exoskeleton or pinning the victim in place. Then comes the tail, that iconic curved stinger loaded with venom. Modern scorpions use venom for two purposes: to subdue prey and to defend against threats. The venom is produced in a gland at the base of the stinger and injected through a sharp, hollow tip dot. We don't have direct fossil evidence of Pulmonoscorpius's venom gland soft tissue. Rarely fossilizes, but there's no reason to think it was any less equipped than modern scorpions. In fact, its size would have allowed for a much larger venom gland, capable of producing a significant dose. For small prey arthropods, early insects, the venom would have been instantly lethal. For larger prey, like juvenile tetrapods, it would cause paralysis, muscle spasms, and eventually death. Either way, once you were stung, it was over. But venom wasn't the only weapon. Those pedipalps weren't just for grabbing. The inner edge was serrated, covered in small ridges that acted like teeth. This made them perfect for gripping soft, slippery prey. An amphibian trying to wriggle free would only tear its own skin on those serrations, making escape even harder. So what did Pulmonoscorpius eat? Probably a bit of everything. Smaller arthropods would have been easy pickings. Millipedes, primitive, insects, other arachnids, anything that wandered too close was fair game. But fossil evidence suggests it might have also hunted vertebrates. Early amphibians were just beginning to explore life on land during the Carboniferous. They were clumsy, slow, and vulnerable. Many of them were small, just a few inches long, perfect prey for a scorpion this size, and even the larger amphibians, if they were young or injured, would have been at risk. Pulmonoscorpius likely dragged its prey into a hidden spot to feed, tearing off pieces with its cheliceraetha, small, claw-like, mouth parts near its mouth. Scorpions are messy eaters. They crush and grind their food into a pulp, then suck up the liquefied tissues. It's not pretty, but it's effective. And the best part, Pulmonoscorpius was nearly invincible. Its exoskeleton was thick, tough, and armored. Few predators would have been able to crack through it. Even Meganeura, if it somehow managed to catch a young scorpion, would struggle to do any real damage. This was a creature built for survival. It could hide, it could wait, it could sense prey from a distance. And when it struck with lethal precision. Fossils of Pulmonoscorpius were first discovered in Scotland's Kirkton Quarry, in sediments that were once part of a Carboniferous wetland. The preservation is incredible. You can see the segmented body, the structure of the legs, even the curve of the tail. It's like a snapshot from 300 million years ago, frozen in stone. But as terrifying as Pulmonoscorpius was, it wasn't the biggest arthropod on the forest floor, not even close, because somewhere nearby, pushing through the ferns and dead vegetation, was something that would make even a giant scorpion think twice. Something that looked like a living nightmare at a first glance. You might think it's a fallen tree trunk lying across the forest floor, dark, segmented, maybe 8 feet long. But then, it moves. It bends around the base of a lycopod tree, dozens of legs rippling in coordinated waves, each one pushing against the soft peat, propelling the creature forward. This is Arthropleura, and it is, without question, the largest land invertebrate that has ever lived. Arthropleura looked like a millipede, but calling it a millipede is like calling a blue whale a big fish. Technically the same family, sure, but the scale is just wrong. This thing could grow up to 8.5 feet long and weigh as much as a large dog. Some estimates suggest it could have weighed over 100 pounds. Its body was made up of dozens of armored segments, each one covered in hard, interlocking plates. From above, it would have looked like a living tank, its dorsal surface nearly impenetrable. Those plates weren't just for shows, they were genuine armor, protecting Arthropleura from predators and from the rough, obstacle-filled environment of the Carboniferous forest floor. Beneath each segment was a pair of legs, dozens of them in total, working together in coordinated waves to push the creature forward. It probably wasn't fast. With that much mass, speed would have been difficult, but it didn't need to be fast. It was powerful. Imagine the force required to push a 100-pound body through thick undergrowth, over fallen logs, through sticky peat. Arthropleura had the muscle and the mechanical advantage to do it without breaking stride. It could plow through obstacles that would stop smaller animals dead in their tracks. So what did it eat? For a long time, scientists assumed that something this big and this heavily armored must have been a predator, a giant carnivorous millipede, crushing other arthropods in its jaws and devouring them whole. But the evidence doesn't support that. Arthropleura's mouthparts, or what little we can reconstruct from fossils, lack the sharp, piercing structures you'd expect from a predator. Instead, they seem designed for grinding and mashing soft material. Most scientists now believe Arthropleura was a herbivore, or it probably fed on decaying plant matter, mosses, fungi, and rotting wood. The forest floor in the Carboniferous was covered in dead vegetation, fallen lycopod trunks, heaps of ferns, layers of peat. Arthropleura would have been nature's recycling crew, slowly converting all that organic matter into mulch. And honestly, that makes it even more impressive. This wasn't a fearsome predator. He was a giant, armored compost machine, quietly breaking down the forest, one mouthful at a time. But even as a herbivore, Arthropleura was nearly untouchable. Its size alone made it a difficult target. Pulmonoscorpius might have been able to take down a juvenile Arthropleura, but an adult, no chance. The armor was too thick. The body was too massive. Even Meganeura, swooping down from above, wouldn't have been able to do much damage in a world of predators. Being huge was one of the best defenses you could have. We know Arthropleura was widespread because fossils have been found across Europe and North America. But here's the frustrating part. We've never found a complete head. The exact structure of its mouthparts, the arrangement of its sensory organs, even the shape of its skull, all of it remains a mystery. What we do have are trackways, fossilized trails left behind in Carboniferous mud, now preserved in stone. Some of these tracks are huge, wide, deep impressions showing where each leg touched down. You could literally lie down inside one of these trackways. It's humbling. Those tracks tell us that Arthropleura spent a lot of time in wet, muddy environments, swamps, riverbanks, flooded forests, places where vegetation was rotting and food was abundant. And for millions of years, it thrived. No predator, no competition, just endless forests full of decaying plant matter, and an 8-foot millipede slowly, methodically eating its way through it all. But not all the giants of the Carboniferous were what they seemed. Some of them were misunderstood for decades, given terrifying names that turned out to be, well, not quite accurate. And that's where our next creature comes in. For decades, paleontologists thought they'd found the ultimate Carboniferous horror, the largest spider to have ever lived. They called it Meganeura, mega meaning huge, arachne from the Greek word for spider. The name alone was enough to fuel nightmares. Textbooks described it as an 8-legged terror with a leg span that could cover a dinner plate. Documentaries featured dramatic reconstructions of it lurking in the undergrowth, waiting to ambush unsuspecting prey. It became one of the poster children for Carboniferous gigantism, proof that even spiders grew to monstrous sizes in that oxygen-rich world. There was just one problem. It wasn't a spider. In 2005, Dr. Paul Selden and his team re-examined the original Megaroct fossil, and what they found changed everything. Megaroct wasn't an arachnid at all. It was a Eurypteridae member of an ancient group of arthropods, more commonly known as sea scorpions. Now, this might sound like a minor reclassification. Spider, sea, scorpion. What's the difference? But the difference is huge. Because Eurypteridae weren't land predators stalking through the forest. They were aquatic or semi-aquatic creatures, living in rivers, swamps, and shallow coastal waters. Megaroct didn't creep through the undergrowth on 8 legs. It crawled along the muddy bottoms of Carboniferous riverbeds, sweeping through sediment with paddle-like limbs, searching for worms, insect larvae, and other small prey. Its body was heavily armored, with a thick carapace that looked superficially like a spider's cephalothorax, which is why it was misidentified in the first place. But its limbs were all wrong for a land-dwelling spider. They were broad, flat, and designed for digging and sifting, not for walking on solid ground. Megaroct was still impressive. Estimates based on the fossil suggest a body length of about 21 inches, making it one of the largest freshwater eurypterids known. But it wasn't the terrestrial nightmare people imagined. It was a bottom feeder, a scavenger, quietly living its life in the murky waters of the Carboniferous. And honestly, that's kind of more interesting, because eurypterids have a fascinating evolutionary story. They were some of the earliest arthropods to experiment with life in different environments. Most eurypterids lived in the ocean, where some species like Echolopteras grew to over 8 feet long, making them the largest arthropods to have ever existed, period. But some eurypterids, like Meganeura, adapted to freshwater. They moved into rivers and swamps, filling ecological niches that hadn't been occupied before. They were pioneers, testing the boundaries of where arthropods could live. And this leads us to another group of misunderstood creatures, the Trigonotarbids. Trigonotarbids looked like spiders. For a long time, they were classified as spiders, but they weren't. They were a separate group of arachnoids, distinct from true spiders, and they hold a special place in evolutionary history. Why? Because they were among the first true terrestrial predators, air-breathing, fully adapted to life on land. Fossils date them back to at least 419 million years ago, well before the Carboniferous even started. They were some of the first creatures to leave the water and claim the land as their own. Trigonotarbids were small. Most species ranged from a few millimeters to about 2 inches long. But don't let the size fool you. These were formidable hunters in their size class. They had 8 legs, just like spiders. Their bodies were low to the ground, armored with a hard carapace that protected their head and thorax, and their abdomens were covered in segmented plates, giving them flexibility without sacrificing protection. But here's the key difference. They couldn't spin webs. They had no silk glands, no spinnerets. They couldn't create traps or wrap up their prey. They had to hunt the old-fashioned way by chasing down their victims and overpowering them with raw force. Their prey were small, soft-bodied invertebrates, springtails, tiny mites, other arachnids, anything they could catch and overpower. Their chelicerae, the small, claw-like mouthparts near the mouth, were strong enough to crush and tear. Once captured, the prey was held in place by the legs and consumed alive. It's brutal, but it worked. For tens of millions of years, Trigonotarbids were successful predators, filling an ecological niche that didn't exist before them. Fossil sites like Rhynie Chert in Scotland have preserved Trigonotarbids in stunning detail. We conceive their respiratory organs book lungs, just like modern scorpions and spiders. We can see the structure of their legs, down to the tiny hairs that help them sense vibrations. We can even see their mouthparts frozen in the act of feeding. It's a window into a world that was just beginning, a world where land was still new, still dangerous, still being conquered by creatures, fifth, that were figuring out how to survive outside the water. But Trigonotarbids eventually went extinct. Not in some dramatic event. They just faded away. Out by spiders, which evolved the ability to produce silk and build webs. Spiders could catch prey without chasing it. They could create shelters. They could lay egg sacs and protect their young. They were simply more versatile, and so the Trigonotarbids disappeared, leaving only fossils behind. A reminder that evolution isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about being the most adaptable. But there's one more creature we need to talk about. One more piece of the Carboniferous puzzle. And this one is so bizarre, so heavily armored, so over-engineered for its size, that it almost doesn't seem real. Meet Lagania orlei, better known by its nickname, the Excalibur worm. Lagania lived over 400 million years ago, during the Devonian period, before the Carboniferous even began. It was tiny, just a few millimeters long, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in armor. This little worm was covered head to tail in overlapping mineralized plates made of crystalline calcite, each plate interlocked with the next, creating a flexible yet nearly impenetrable suit of armor. It looked like medieval chainmail, except on a creature the size of a grain of rice. When threatened, Lagania could curl into a ball, just like a modern pillbug, and once it did, there was no breaking through. The armor was that good. For a predator in its size class, maybe a small aquatic arthropod or worm attacking Lagania would have been pointless. It was like trying to bite through a rock. The nickname Excalibur worm comes from the legendary sword in Arthurian legend. Just like the sword embedded in the stone, Lagania seemed too perfect, too finely crafted, too advanced for its time. It was an evolutionary masterpiece, a tiny creature that achieved near invincibility through sheer defensive engineering. But like all extreme adaptations, there was a cost. That heavy armor made Leganius slow. It couldn't move quickly. It couldn't disperse to new habitats easily. And as the world changed, as new, faster predators evolved, being slow and heavily armored wasn't enough anymore. Eventually, Legania went extinct. But for a time, it lived wrapped in crystal plates, a walking fortress in a dangerous world. These creatures, Arachne, the Trigonitabids Loganeth, they remind us that the Carboniferous wasn't just about giants. It was about diversity, about experimentation, about life, trying every possible strategy to survive and thrive. Some strategies worked for millions of years, others failed quickly, but each one left a mark, a fossil record that tells us something about what life was like in that strange, oxygen-rich world. And as we'll see in the next chapter, even the most successful strategies have their limits, because the world was changing, the oxygen was falling, and the giants know, no matter how powerful, how armored, how perfectly adapted, we're running out of time. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not species, not even atmospheric conditions that seem stable for millions of years. The Carboniferous giants Meganeura, with its 2-foot wingspan, Pulmonoscorpius with its crushing pincers, Arthropleura, crawling through forests like an armored bust, they all seemed invincible, perfectly adapted, dominant, but they were living on borrowed time, because the very thing that made them possible, that oxygen-rich atmosphere, was already starting to slip away. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like flipping a switch. The end of the Carboniferous was more like a slow fade, a gradual decline that played out over millions of years. But for the creatures that depended on that hyperoxic world, it might as well have been sudden death. So what happened? Why did oxygen levels fall? And more importantly, why can't they ever rise that high again? The answer involves fungi, forests, and one of the most important evolutionary breakthroughs in Earth's history. Let's start with the forests. For tens of millions of years, the Carboniferous swamp forests pumped out oxygen at an incredible rate. Giant lycopods, seed ferns, horsetails, all of them photosynthesizing constantly, taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. And when these plants died, they didn't rot away like modern plants do. They just piled up. Remember, this was before evolution had figured out how to efficiently break down lignin, the tough polymer that gives plants their woody structure. Lignin is incredibly resistant to decay. It's like nature's version of plastic, strong, stable, and nearly impossible to break down without specialized enzymes. So when a 100-foot lycopod fell over and died, it didn't decompose. It got buried in the swampy, waterlogged soil, sealed, away from oxygen. And there it stayed, slowly compressing over millions of years into coal. This created a one-way flow of carbon. Plants pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, stored it in their tissues, and when they died, that carbon got locked underground, permanently. Meanwhile, the oxygen they produced stayed in the atmosphere, building up higher and higher. It was an imbalance, a temporary glitch in Earth's carbon cycle. Unlike all imbalances, it couldn't last forever. Around 300 million years ago, something changed. A group of fungi evolved a new ability, the ability to break down lignin efficiently. These white rot fungi developed specialized enzymes that could tear apart the tough polymer, releasing the stored carbon back into the atmosphere. It was a quiet revolution. No explosions, no dramatic extinctions, just fungi, slowly spreading through the forests, doing what fungi do best, decomposing things. But the effects were profound. Suddenly, dead plants weren't getting buried anymore. They were being broken down, recycled, their carbon returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The one-way carbon stream became a two-way exchange, and as carbon dioxide levels rose, oxygen levels fell. It wasn't immediate. It took millions of years for the atmospheric balance to shift, but shift it did. From a peak of around 35% oxygen, levels began to drop, first to 30%, then 25%, then lower. And the giants started to struggle. Remember how insect respiration works. Oxygen diffuses passively through tiny tubes called trachea, spreading throughout the body without any active pumping. In a 35% oxygen atmosphere, this works great even for large insects. But as oxygen levels fall, diffusion becomes less efficient. Oxygen can't travel as far through those tubes. The center of a large insect's body starts to become starved of oxygen. For smaller insects, this wasn't a problem. Their bodies were small enough that oxygen could still reach every cell. Before the giants, it was a death sentence. A dragonfly with a 2-foot wingspan needs a lot of oxygen to power its flight muscles. A scorpion the size of a cat needs oxygen to fuel its ambush strikes and venom production. A millipede the length of a couch needs oxygen to move all those legs, to digest food, to survive. And as the atmosphere changed, they couldn't get enough. But falling oxygen wasn't the only problem. The forests themselves were disappearing as the continents continued to collide. Forming the supercontinent Pangaea, the climate began to change. Mountain ranges rose where continents crashed together, altering wind patterns and rainfall. The warm, humid, swampy lowlands that had covered much of the world started to dry out. The great coal swamps began to fragment. In some areas, they disappeared entirely, replaced by drier forests or open grasslands. This shift is called the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, and it happened around 305 million years ago. Imagine being a giant insect, adapted to life in a humid swamp forest. You need moisture, you need the dense vegetation, you need the oxygen-rich air, and suddenly, over the course of just a few million years, all of that starts to vanish. Your habitat fragments into isolated petals, the air becomes drier, oxygen levels drop, food sources disappear, and you're too big, too specialized, too dependent on conditions that no longer exist. For many species, this was the end. Fossil diversity drops sharply during this period. Entire lineages of giant arthropods disappear from the record, not all at once, but gradually, as their world transformed into something they couldn't survive in, and as the oxygen fell and the swamps dried up. Another problem emerged: fire. You'd think that less oxygen would mean fewer fires, right? But here's the paradox: while extremely high oxygen levels made even wet vegetation flammable, the drying climate meant that fires became more frequent and more destructive in a different way. The forests that remained burned more icily, and without the constant humidity to protect them, these fires could rage for longer periods. Charcoal deposits from the late Carboniferous show evidence of massive, repeated wildfires. Some of these burns would have wiped out entire ecosystems, destroying habitats that took centuries to grow back. For large, slow-moving arthropods like escaping a fast-moving forest fire would have been nearly impossible. For aerial predators like Meganeura, the smoke and ash in the air would have made hunting difficult, maybe even impossible for extended periods. The world was becoming hostile in ways the giants couldn't adapt to. But there was one more factor in their decline, one that's often overlooked, but arguably the most important of all: competition. While the giant arthropods were struggling, another group of animals was just getting started, a group that would eventually inherit the Earth, that would diversify into thousands of species, that would give rise to dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and eventually us. Reptiles. Early reptiles appeared during the Carboniferous, probably around 320 million years ago. They were small, just a few inches long, and didn't look particularly impressive. But they had something the amphibians didn't have, something revolutionary. The amniotic egg. Amphibians, no matter how large they grew, were still tied to water for reproduction. They had to lay their eggs in ponds or streams. The eggs had no protective shell, so they'd dry out on land. This meant amphibians could never stray too far from water, could never fully colonize the drier inland areas. But reptiles, they laid eggs with hard shells and internal membranes that kept the developing embryo moist. They could lay eggs on land, in relatively dry environments, without worrying about them desiccating. This was a game changer. Suddenly, vertebrates could move inland. They could colonize areas that were off limits to their amphibian ancestors. And as the climate dried and swamps shrank, this gave them a massive advantage. But the amniotic egg wasn't the only thing reptiles had going for them. They also had better respiratory systems. Unlike insects, which rely on passive diffusion, vertebrates have lungs and circulatory systems that actively transport oxygen throughout the body. Blood picks up oxygen in the lungs and carries it to cells via hemoglobin, a specialized protein that binds oxygen molecules. This system is way more efficient than tracheal breathing, especially as body size increases. It's also more adaptable to changing oxygen levels. When oxygen is abundant, vertebrates can take smaller breaths and still get enough. When oxygen is scarce, They can breathe faster or deeper to compensate. Insects don't have that flexibility. They're stuck with their tracheal system, and that system has hard limits. As oxygen levels fell from 35% to 25% and eventually to around 15%. During parts of the Permian period, the era that followed the Carboniferous, reptiles adapted. They evolved larger lungs, better circulation, more efficient oxygen extraction, and they kept growing, not to the massive sizes of the Carboniferous arthropods, but large enough to compete, large enough to hunt, large enough to dominate. By the dawn of the Permian period, around 299 million years ago, the balance of power had shifted. The age of giant arthropods was over. The age of reptiles was just beginning, and for the arthropods there was no going back. The atmospheric conditions that made their gigantism possible were gone. The forests that supported them had transformed or vanished, and the competitors that could outperform them in the new lower oxygen world were everywhere. Some lineages adapted. They got smaller, more efficient, more versatile. The descendants of those survivors are still with us. Today, modern dragonflies, scorpions, millipedes, they're smaller than their ancestors, sure, but they're successful. They've colonized virtually every terrestrial habitat on the planet. But the giants, they were gone, extinct, relegated to the fossil record, preserved in ancient stone, waiting for curious humans to dig them up millions of years later and try to piece together what they looked like, how they lived, and why they disappeared. The fall of the Carboniferous giants wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was a cascade of changes, atmospheric, climatic, ecological, that created a perfect storm of selection pressures, and the creatures that had thrived for 60 million years simply couldn't keep up. As the Carboniferous faded into the Permian period, Earth was transforming into something unrecognizable from what it had been. The lush, humid swamp forests were shrinking, replaced by drier woodlands and open landscapes. The oxygen was dropping, and a new cast of characters was taking center stage. The reptiles didn't just survive the transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian. They exploded in diversity. Within a few million years, they had split into multiple lineages, each one experimenting with different body plans, different diets, different survival strategies. Some became herbivores, munching on the new types of vegetation that was spreading across the drier landscapes. Others became predators, hunting the other reptiles. The remaining amphibians, and yes, even the smaller arthropods, and they got big, really big. One of the most successful early reptile groups was the Paleontology. You might recognize one of them, Dimetrodon, the sail-backed predator that's often mistakenly called a dinosaur. It wasn't. Dinosaurs wouldn't appear for another 50 million years. Dimetrodon grew up to 15 feet long and weighed several hundred pounds. It was a formidable predator, with rows of sharp serrated teeth designed for slicing through flesh. And that iconic sail on its back, scientists think it helped regulate body temperature, absorbing heat from the sun or releasing it into the air, allowing Dimetrodon to stay active when other reptiles were sluggish. But Dimetrodon was just one of many. The Permian saw the rise of synapsids, the group that would eventually give rise to mammals. Early synapsids ranged from small rat-sized creatures to massive co-sized herbivores. They diversified rapidly, filling ecological niches that had barely existed in the Carboniferous. And here's the key thing: they could do it because they weren't limited by oxygen levels. Their respiratory and circulatory systems were efficient enough to function even as atmospheric oxygen continued to drop. By the middle of the Permian period, oxygen levels had fallen to around 15% lower than what we breathe today. For humans, living in that atmosphere would feel like being at high altitude constantly. You'd be short of breath, tired, unable to exert yourself for long periods. But for the reptiles and synapsids, it was fine. They adapted. They evolved more efficient lungs, higher red blood cell counts, better oxygen carrying capacity in their blood. Meanwhile, the remaining giant arthropods were suffocating, literally. Their passive respiratory systems couldn't extract enough oxygen from the thinning air. One by one, the last of the giants disappeared. Arthropleura went extinct. Pulmonoscorpius vanished. Meganeura and its relatives dwindled and eventually died out. The era of giant insects was over. But insects didn't disappear entirely. Far from it. They adapted. They evolved. They got smaller, sure, but they also got more diverse. During the Permian and Triassic periods, insects developed new strategies. Some evolved more efficient tracheal systems, with muscles that could actively pump air through their bodies instead of relying purely on diffusion. Others developed thicker cuticles to prevent water loss in the drier climate. Still others evolved new feeding strategies, sucking plant sap, boring into wood, scavenging dead material. And then, around 150 million years ago, another group joined the decomposition game: termites. Termites might seem insignificant, but they're incredibly important to Earth's carbon cycle. They evolved specialized gut bacteria that could break down cellulose, the main structural component of plant cell walls. This made them incredibly efficient at decomposing wood. Today, termites process about a third of all dead wood in tropical environments. They are one of the most important decomposer groups on the planet, and their evolution was another nail in the coffin for any hope of oxygen levels rising back to Carboniferous heights. Because now, between the lignin-degrading fungi and the cellulose-eating termites, dead plant material doesn't accumulate anymore. It gets broken down, recycled, its carbon returned to the atmosphere. The carbon cycle is balanced in a way it wasn't during the Carboniferous. And that balance is permanent, or at least, it will be for as long as these decomposers exist. This is why we'll never see 35% oxygen again. It's not just about the forests or the climate, it's about the fact that life itself has evolved to prevent that kind of oxygen buildup. The system has self-correcting mechanisms, now feedback loops, that keep atmospheric gases within a certain range. When oxygen starts to rise, fires increase, consuming plant matter and releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. When carbon dioxide starts to rise, plants grow faster, pulling carbon back out of the air. It's a dynamic equilibrium, constantly adjusting, constantly rebalancing. The Carboniferous oxygen peak was an anomaly, a one-time event caused by a temporary imbalance, plants producing lignin faster than anything could break it down. Once that imbalance was corrected, the door closed, and it's not opening again. But here's the thing, even though the giants are gone, their legacy remains. Every piece of coal we burn is a remnant of the Carboniferous forests. Every dragonfly we see is a descendant of Meganeura's lineage. Every breath we take is influenced by the oxygen-producing plants that first evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. The Carboniferous wasn't just a weird chapter in Earth's history. It was a turning point, a moment when life experimented with atmospheric chemistry on a planetary scale, and the results were both spectacular and terrifying. And the lessons from that era are more relevant today than ever before, because once again, atmospheric chemistry is changing, not because of oxygen this time, but because of carbon dioxide. And once again, life on Earth is going to have to adapt. Let's zoom out for a moment. Way out. Let's look at the entire history of oxygen on Earth, because the Carboniferous peak is just one chapter in a much longer story. For the first 2 billion years of Earth's existence, there was almost no oxygen in the atmosphere, less than 0.001%. The planet was dominated by anaerobic organisms, bacteria that didn't need oxygen, that actually found it toxic. Then, around 2.4 billion years ago, something revolutionary happened. Cyanobacteria evolved photosynthesis, the ability to use sunlight to split water molecules, producing energy and releasing oxygen as waste. At first, the oxygen didn't accumulate. It reacted with dissolved iron in the oceans, creating massive rust deposits called banded iron formations. These rust layers are some of the largest ore deposits on Earth, and they're still mined today for iron. But eventually, all the iron in the oceans oxidized, and the oxygen started spilling into the atmosphere. This is called the Great Oxygenation Event, and it was Earth's first atmospheric revolution. Oxygen levels rose from nearly zero to maybe 1 or 2% of the atmosphere. For anaerobic organisms, this was catastrophic. Oxygen was poison to them. Many went extinct. Others retreated to oxygen-free environments, deep sediments, swamps, the guts of animals where they still live today. But for organisms that could use oxygen, it was a goldmine. Aerobic respiration, using oxygen to break down sugars and produce energy, is incredibly efficient. It produces far more energy than anaerobic processes. And that extra energy allowed life to become more complex. For the next 1.5 billion years, oxygen levels remained relatively low, fluctuating between 1 and 10%. Then, around 800 million years ago, came another spike, the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event. Oxygen levels rose to around 15%, possibly higher, and not coincidentally, This is when the first complex animals appeared. Sponges, jellyfish, the strange creatures of the Ediacaran period. Higher oxygen meant more energy available, and more energy meant more complexity. From about 550 to 400 million years ago, oxygen gradually increased to around 20% as plants colonized the land. Then came the Carboniferous spike up to 35%, followed by the decline we've already discussed. Since then, oxygen has fluctuated, but never returned to Carboniferous levels. There was another peak during the Cretaceous period, around 100 million years ago, when oxygen may have reached 25 to 30%. This coincided with the age of dinosaurs, and it may be one reason some dinosaurs could grow so large. For the past 60 million years, oxygen has gradually declined to our current 21%. And here's the fascinating pattern. Every major increase in atmospheric oxygen corresponds with the emergence of more complex, more energy-demanding life forms. Oxygen isn't just a background condition for life, it's a driver of evolutionary innovation. The Great Oxygenation event paved the way for eukaryotic cells, complex cells with nuclei and organelles. The Neoproterozoic increase preceded the Cambrian explosion of animal diversity. The Carboniferous peak enabled the first large land animals. Oxygen is fuel, and the more fuel available, the more ambitious life can become. But here's where things get uncomfortable, because for the first time in Earth's history, one species use is capable of significantly altering atmospheric chemistry on a global scale. And we're doing it fast. Faster than natural systems can adjust. Human activities are causing a very slight decrease in atmospheric oxygen, about 0.001% per year, as we burn fossil fuels. That rate is too small to affect human health directly. You won't suffocate because of it, but it represents something profound. We've become a geological force. The more immediate concern is carbon dioxide. Since the Industrial Revolution, atmospheric CO2 has risen from about 280 parts per million to over 420 parts per million. That's a 50% increase in less than 200 years. For context, the transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian, the atmospheric shift that killed the giant insects, took millions of years. We're causing a comparable shift in mere centuries. And just like the Carboniferous giants couldn't adapt fast enough to changing oxygen levels, many species today are struggling to adapt to changing CO2 levels and the climate effects that come with them. The lesson from the Carboniferous is clear. When atmospheres change, life changes, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically, but always inevitably. Coral reefs are bleaching because ocean temperatures are rising. Polar bears are struggling because Arctic ice is melting. Insect populations are crashing in many parts of the world, not because of oxygen levels, but because of habitat loss, pesticides, and climate disruption. The details are different, but the principle is the same. Change the atmospheric chemistry, and you change the rules of survival. But there's also hope in the Carboniferous story, because life didn't end when oxygen levels fell. It adapted. Insects got smaller but more diverse. Reptiles rose to dominance. New ecosystems emerged, different from what came before, but just as complex and vibrant. Life is resilient. Not in the sense that it's unchangeable, but in the sense that it finds ways to continue, even when the conditions shift dramatically. The question for us isn't whether life will survive the changes we're causing. It will. Life survived the Great Oxygenation event, the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, the Permian extinction, the worst extinction in Earth's history, and the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. Life is stubborn. It persists. It adapts. The real question is, what kind of world do we want to live in? Because while life as a whole will continue, individual species, including, potentially, our own, might not fare so well if the changes come too fast. The Carboniferous giants teach us that being perfectly adapted to current conditions is no guarantee of survival when those conditions change. Flexibility matters more than perfection. Adaptability matters more than size or strength. And for humanity, with our tremendous technological capabilities, that means we have choices. We can choose to understand these systems. We can choose to work with them rather than against them. We can choose to slow down the changes we're causing, giving ecosystems time to adjust. Or we can keep going, keep burning fossil fuels, those Carboniferous forests, ironically, keep pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, and see what happens. The Earth will be fine either way. It survived far worse. But us, our civilization, our ecosystems, our way of life, That's less certain. The Carboniferous reminds us that Earth has been many different worlds. It's been an anaerobic planet. It's been an oxygen-rich jungle world with giant insects. It's been a loxygen world dominated by early reptiles. It's been a warm, tropical world with dinosaurs. Right now, it's a world with 21% oxygen, moderate temperatures, and incredible biodiversity. But it won't stay this way forever. Nothing does. The question is whether we'll be wise enough to recognize what we have, to appreciate the delicate balance that makes our current world possible, and to act accordingly. Because once a world changes, once oxygen levels fall or CO2 levels rise beyond a certain threshold, you can't just turn back the clock. The Carboniferous giants can't come back. The conditions that created them are gone forever, locked away by evolutionary innovations that can't be undone. And, if we're not careful, the world we know, the one with coral reefs and rainforests and polar ice and all the biodiversity we've grown up with, could become just another chapter in Earth's long history, a memory preserved only in the fossil record, waiting for some future species to dig us up and wonder what we were like and why we disappeared. The Carboniferous ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, a slow fade as oxygen levels dropped and forests changed. The giants didn't know what was happening. They couldn't understand that their world was disappearing. But we can. We have the knowledge. We have the data. We can see the changes happening in real time. And that gives us something the Carboniferous giants never had: the ability to choose our response. We can learn from deep time. We can recognize that Earth's systems are interconnected, that atmospheric chemistry matters, that change is inevitable, but the speed and severity of change can be influenced. The legacy of Arthropleura and Pulmonoscorpius isn't just a collection of cool fossils. It's a lesson written in stone about what happens when conditions change and organisms can't keep up. The question is, are we listening?